This is a continuation of The Status Civilization by Robert Sheckley, comprising chapters 20 through 24. Chapter 20. According to Elan, Group 2 had at least one serious flaw. The men who composed it were, for the most part, past their physical prime. There were some younger members, of course, but they had had little contact with violence and little chance to develop traits of self-sufficiency. Secure in the underground, most of them had never fired a beamer in anger, had never been forced to run for their lives, had never encountered the make-or-break situations through which Barent had lived. They were brave but unproven. They would willingly undertake the expedition to Earth, but they would have little chance of success. "And you think I would have a chance?" Barent asked. "I think so. You're young and strong, reasonably intelligent, and extremely resourceful. You have a high survival quotient. If any man could succeed, I believe you could." "Why one man?" "Because there's no sense in sending a group. The chance of detection would simply be increased. By using one man, we get maximum security and opportunity. If you succeed, we will receive valuable information about the nature of the enemy. If you don't succeed, if you are captured, your attempt will be considered the action of an individual rather than a group. We will still be free to start a general uprising from Omega." "How am I supposed to get back to Earth?" Barent asked. "Do you have a starship hidden away somewhere?" "I'm afraid not. We plan to transport you to Earth aboard the next prison ship." "That's impossible." "Not at all. We've studied the landings. They follow a pattern. The prisoners are marched out, accompanied by the guards. While they're assembled in the square, the ship itself is undefended, although loosely surrounded by a cordon of guards. To get you aboard, we will start a disturbance. It should take away the guards' attention long enough for you to get on board." "Even if I succeed, I'll be captured as soon as the guards return." "You shouldn't be," Aelin said. "The prison ship is an immense structure with many hiding places for a stowaway, and the element of surprise will be in your favor. This may be the first time in the history of Omega that an escape has been attempted." "And when the ship reaches Earth?" "You will be disguised as a member of the ship's personnel," Elan said. "Remember, the inevitable inefficiency of a huge bureaucracy will be working for you." "I hope so," Barent said. "Let's suppose I reach Earth safely and get the information you want. How do I send it back?" "You send it back on the next prison ship," Elan said. "We plan to capture that one." Barent rubbed his forehead wearily. "What makes you think that any of this, my expedition or your uprising, can succeed against an organization as powerful as Earth?" "We have to take the chance," Elan said. "Take it, or go down in a bloody shambles with the rest of Omega. I agree that the odds are weighted against us, but our choice is either to make the attempt or to die without making any attempt at all." Moira nodded at this. "Also, the situation has other possibilities. The government of Earth is obviously repressive. That argues the existence of underground resistance groups on Earth itself. You may be able to contact those groups. A revolt both here and on Earth would give the government something to think about." "Maybe," Barent said. "We have to hope for the best," Elan said. "Are you with us?" "Certainly," Barent said. "I'd rather die on Earth than on Omega." "The prison ship lands in 6 days," Elan said. "During that time, we will give you the information we have about Earth. Part of it is memory reconstruction. Part has been screnned by the mutants, and the rest is logical constructs. It's all we have, and I think it gives a reasonably accurate picture of current conditions on Earth." "How soon do we start?" Barent asked. "Right now," Elan said. Barent received a general briefing on the physical makeup of Earth, its climate and major population centers. Then he was sent to Colonel Bray, formerly of the Earth Deep Space Establishment. Bray talked to him about the probable military strength of Earth as represented by the number of guardships around Omega and their apparent level of scientific development. He gave estimates of the size of the Earth forces, their probable divisions into land, sea, and space groups, their assumed level of efficiency. An aide, Captain Carell, lectured on special weapons, their probable types and ranges, their availability to the general Earth population. Another aide, Lieutenant Daoud, talked about detection devices, their probable locations, and how to avoid them. Then Barent was turned back to Elan for political indoctrination. From him, Barent learned that Earth was believed to be a dictatorship. He learned the methods of a dictatorship, its peculiar strengths and weaknesses, the role of the secret police, the use of terror, the problem of informers. When Alan was finished with him, Barrett went to a small, beady-eyed man who lectured on Earth's memory-destroying system. Using the premise that memory destruction was regularly employed to render opposition ineffective, the man went on to construct the probable nature of an underground movement on Earth given those circumstances, and how Barrett might contact them, and what the underground's capabilities might be. Finally, he was given the full details of Group 2's plan for getting him on board the ship. When landing day came, Barrett felt a definite sense of relief. He was heartily sick of day and night cramming. Any sort of action would seem an improvement. Chapter 21. Barrett watched the huge prison ship maneuver into position and sink noiselessly to the ground. It gleamed dully in the afternoon sun, tangible proof of Earth's long reach and powerful grasp. A hatch opened, and a landing stage was let down. The prisoners, flanked by guards, marched down and assembled in the square. As usual, most of the population of Tetrahide had gathered to watch and cheer the disembarkation ceremony. Barrett moved through the crowd and stationed himself behind the ranks of prisoners and guards. He touched his pocket to make sure the needlebeam was still there. It had been made for him by Group 2 fabricators, completely of plastic to escape any metals detector. The rest of his pockets were stuffed with equipment. He hoped he wouldn't have to use any of it. The loudspeaker voice began to read off the prisoners' numbers, as it had when Barrett had disembarked. He listened, knees slightly bent, waiting for the beginning of the diversion. The loudspeaker voice was coming to the end of the prisoner list. There were only 10 left. Barrett edged forward. The voice droned on. 4 prisoners left? 3? As the number of the last prisoner was announced, the diversion began. A black cloud of smoke darkened the pale sky, and Barrett knew that the group had set fire to the empty barracks in Square A2. He waited. Then it came. There was a stupendous explosion, blasting through 2 rows of empty buildings. The shockwave was staggering. Even before debris began to fall, Barrett was running toward the ship. The second and third explosions went off as he came into the ship's shadow. Quickly, he stripped off his Omegan outer garments. Under them, he wore a facsimile of guard's uniform. Now he ran toward the landing stage. The loudspeaker voice was calling loudly for order. The guards were still bewildered. The 4th explosion threw Barrett to the ground. He got to his feet instantly and sprinted up the landing stage. He was inside the ship. Outside, he could hear the guard captain shouting orders. The guards were beginning to form into ranks, their weapons ready to use against the restive crowd. They were retreating to the ship in good order. Barrett had no more time to listen. He was standing in a long, narrow corridor. He turned to the right and raced toward the bow of the ship. Far behind him, he could hear the heavy, marching tread of the guards. Now, he thought, the information he had been given about the ship had better be right, or the expedition was finished before it began. He sprinted past rows of empty cells and came to a door marked Guard Assembly Room. A lighted green bulb above the door showed that the air system was on. He went by it and came to another door. Barrett tried it now and found it unlocked. Within was a room stacked high with spare engine parts. He entered and closed the door. The guards marched down the corridor. Barrett could hear them talking as they entered the assembly room. What do you think started those explosions? Who knows? Those prisoners are crazy anyhow. They'd blow up the whole planet if they could. Good riddance. Well, it didn't cause any damage. There was an explosion like that about 15 years ago, remember? I wasn't here then. Well, it was worse than this. 2 guards were killed, and maybe 100 prisoners. What started it? Don't know. These Omegans just enjoy blowing things up. Next thing you know, they'll be trying to blow us up. Not a chance. Not with the guard ships up there. You think so? Well, I'll be glad to get back to the checkpoint. You said it. Be good to get off this ship and live a little. It isn't a bad life at the checkpoint, but I'd rather go back to Earth. Well, you can't have everything. The last of the guards entered the assembly room and dogged the door shut. Barrett waited. After a while, he felt the ship vibrate. It was beginning its departure. He had learned some valuable information. Apparently, all or most of the guards got off at the checkpoint. Did that mean that another detachment of guards got on? Probably. And a checkpoint implied that the ship was searched for escaped prisoners. It was probably only a perfunctory search, since no prisoner had escaped in the history of Omega. Still, he would have to figure out a way of avoiding it. But he would face that when the time came. Now he felt the vibration cease, and he knew that the ship had left the surface of Omega. He was aboard, unobserved, and the ship was on its way to Earth. So far, everything had gone according to plan. For the next few hours, Barent stayed in the storage room. He was feeling very tired, and his joints had begun to ache. The air in the small room had a sour, exhausted smell. Forcing himself to his feet, Barent walked to the air vent and put his hand over it. No air was coming through. He took a small gauge out of his pocket. The oxygen content of the room was falling rapidly. Cautiously, he opened the storeroom door and peered out. Although he was dressed in a perfect replica of guard's uniform, he knew he couldn't pass among men who knew each other so well. He had to stay in hiding, and he had to have air. The corridors were deserted. He passed the guard assembly room and heard faint murmurs of conversation inside. The green light glowed brightly over the door. Barent walked on, beginning to feel the first signs of dizziness. His gauge showed him that the oxygen content in the corridor was starting to fall. The group had assumed that the air system would be used throughout the ship. Now Barent could see that, with only guards and crew aboard, there was no need to supply air for the entire ship. There would be air in the little man-inhabited islands of the guard room and the crew's section, and nowhere else. Barent hurried down the dim, silent corridors, gasping for breath. The air was rapidly growing bad. Perhaps it was being used in the assembly room before the ship's main air supply was touched. He passed unlocked doors, but the green bulbs above them were unlighted. He had a pounding headache, and his legs felt as if they were turning to jelly. He tried to figure out a course of action. The crew's section seemed to offer him the best chance. Ship's personnel might not be armed. Even if they were, they would be less ready for trouble than the guards. Perhaps he could hold one of the officers at gunpoint. Perhaps he could take over the ship. It was worth trying. It had to be tried. At the end of the corridor, he came to a staircase. He climbed past a dozen deserted levels and came at last to a stenciled sign on one of the walls. It read Control Section, and an arrow pointed the way. Barent took the plastic needlebeam out of his pocket and staggered down the corridor. He was beginning to lose consciousness. Black shadows formed and dissipated on the edges of his vision. He was experiencing vague hallucinations, flashes of horror in which he felt the corridor walls falling in on him. He found that he was on his hands and knees, crawling toward a door marked Control Room. No admittance except to ship's officers. The corridor seemed to be filled with gray fog. It cleared momentarily, and Barent realized that his eyes were not focusing properly. He pulled himself to his feet and turned the door handle. It began to open. He took a firm grip on the needlebeam and tried to prepare himself for action. But, as the door opened, darkness closed irrevocably around him. He thought he could see startled faces, hear a voice shouting, "Watch out! He's armed." And then the blackness closed in completely, and he fell endlessly forward. Chapter 22. Barent's return to consciousness was sudden and complete. He sat up and saw that he had fallen inside the control room. The metal door was closed behind him, and he was breathing without difficulty. He could see no sign of the crew. They must have gone after the guards, assuming he would stay unconscious. He scrambled to his feet, instinctively picking up his needlebeam. He examined the weapon closely, then frowned and put it away. Why, he wondered, would the crew leave him alone in the control room, the most important part of the ship? Why would they leave him armed? He tried to remember the faces he had seen just before he collapsed. They were indistinct memories, vague and unfocused figures with hollow, dreamlike voices. Had there really been people in here? The more he thought about it, the more certain he was that he had conjured those people out of his fading consciousness. There had been no one here. He was alone in the ship's nerve center. He approached the main control board. It was divided into 10 stations. Each section had its rows of dials, whose slender indicators pointed to incomprehensible readings. Each had its switches, wheels, rheostats, and levers. Barent walked slowly past the stations, watching the patterns of flashing lights that ran to the ceiling and rippled along the walls. The last station seemed to be some kind of overall control for the rest. A small screen was marked. Coordination, manual/automatic. The automatic part was lighted. There were similar screens for navigation, lookout, collision control, subspace entry and exit, normal space entry and exit, and landing. All were automatic. Further on, he found the programming screen, which clicked off the progress of the flight in hours, minutes, and seconds. Time to checkpoint 1 was now 29 hours, 4 minutes, 51 seconds. Stopover time, 3 hours. Time from checkpoint to Earth, 480 hours. The control board flashed and hummed to itself, serene and self-sufficient. Barrett couldn't help feeling that the presence of a human in this temple of the machine was sacrilege. He checked the air ducts. They were set for automatic feed, giving just enough air to support the room's present human population of 1. But where was the crew? Barrett could understand the necessity of operating a starship largely on an automatic programming system. A structure as huge and complex as this had to be self-sufficient. But men had built it, and men had punched out the programs. Why weren't men present to monitor the switchboards, to modify the program when necessary? Suppose the guards had needed more time on Omega. Suppose it became necessary to bypass the checkpoint and return directly to Earth? Suppose it was imperative to change destination altogether? Who reset the programs? Who gave the ship its orders? Who possessed the guiding intelligence that directed the entire operation? Barrett looked around the control room. He found a storage bin filled with oxygen respirators. He put one on, tested it, and went into the corridor. After a long walk, he reached a door marked Crew's Quarters. Inside, the room was neat and bare. The beds stood in neat rows, without sheets or blankets. There were no clothes in the closets, no personal possessions of any kind. Barrett left and inspected the officers' and captain's quarters. He found no sign of recent human habitation. He returned to the control room. It was apparent now that the ship had no crew. Perhaps the authorities on Earth felt so certain of their schedules and of the reliability of their ship that they had decided a crew was superfluous. Perhaps, but it seemed to Barrett a reckless way of doing things. There was something very strange about an Earth that allowed starships to run without human supervision. He decided to suspend further judgment until he had acquired more facts. For the time being, he had to think about the problems of his own survival. There was concentrated food in his pockets, but he hadn't been able to carry much water. Would the crewless ship have supplies? He had to remember the detachment of guards, down below in their assembly room, and he had to think about what was going to happen at the checkpoint, and what he would do about it. Barrett found that he did not have to use his own food supplies. In the officers' mess, machines still dispensed food and drink at the push of a button. Barrett didn't know if these were natural or chemically reconstituted foods. They tasted fine and seemed to nourish him, so he really didn't care. He explored part of the ship's upper levels. After becoming lost several times, he decided not to take any more unnecessary risks. The life center of the ship was its control room, and Barrett spent most of his time there. He found a viewport. Activating the switch that opened the shutters, Barrett was able to look out on the vast spectacle of stars glowing in the blackness of space. Stars without end stretched past the furthest limits of his imagination. Looking at this, Barrett felt a strong surge of pride. This was where he belonged, and those unknown stars were his heritage. The time to the checkpoint dwindled to 6 hours. Barrett watched new portions of the control board come to life, checking and altering the forces governing the ship, preparing for a landing. 3.5 hours before landing, Barrett made an interesting discovery. He found the central communication system for the entire ship. By turning on the receiving end, he could overhear conversations in the guard room. He didn't learn much that was useful to him. Either through caution or lack of concern, the guards didn't discuss politics. Their lives were spent on the checkpoint, except for periods of service on the prison ship. Some of the things they said Barrett found incomprehensible, but he continued to listen, fascinated by anything these men of Earth had to say. "You ever go swimming in Florida? I never liked salt water. The year before I was called to the guards, I won 3rd prize at the Dayton Orchid Fair. I'm buying a retirement villa in Antarctica. How much longer for you? 18 years. Well, someone's got to do it. But why me? And why no Earth leaves? You've watched the tapes, you know why. Crime is a disease. It's infectious. So what? So if you work around criminals, you run the danger of infection. You might contaminate someone on Earth. It isn't fair. Can't be helped. Those scientists know what they're talking about. Besides, Checkpoint's not so bad. If you like everything artificial, air, flowers, food, well, you can't have everything. Your family there? They want to get back Earthside. After 5 years on the checkpoint, they say you can't take Earth. The gravity gets you. I'll take gravity. Anytime. From these conversations, Barrett learned that the grim-faced guards were human beings, just like the prisoners on Omega. Most of the guards didn't seem to like the work they were doing. Like Omegans, they longed for a return to Earth. He stored the information away. The ship had reached the checkpoint, and the giant switchboard flashed and rippled, making its final adjustments for the intricacies of docking. At last the maneuver was completed, and the engines shut down to stand by. Through the communications system, Barrett heard the guards leave their assembly room. He followed them down the corridors to the landing stage. He heard the last of them, as he left the ship, say, "Here comes the check squad. What you say, boys?" There was no answer. The guards were gone, and there was a new sound in the corridors, the heavy marching feet of what the guard called the check squad. There seemed to be a lot of them. Their inspection began in the engine rooms and moved methodically upward. From the sounds, they seemed to be opening every door on the ship and searching every room and closet. Barrett held the needle beam in his perspiring hand and wondered where, in all the territory of the ship, he could hide. He would have to assume that they were going to look everywhere. In that case, his best chance lay in evading them and hiding in a section of the ship already searched. He slipped a respirator over his head and moved into the corridor. Chapter 23. Half an hour later, Barrett still hadn't figured out a way of getting past the check squad. They had finished inspecting the lower levels and were moving up to the control room deck. Barrett could hear them marching down the hallways. He kept on walking, 100 yards in front, trying to find some way of hiding. There should be a staircase at the end of this passageway. He could take it down to a different level, a part of the ship which had already been searched. He hurried on, wondering if he were wrong about the location of the staircase. He still had only the haziest idea of the layout of the ship. If he were wrong, he would be trapped. He came to the end of the corridor, and the staircase was there. The footsteps behind him sounded closer. He started down, peering backwards over his shoulder, and ran headfirst into a man's huge chest. Barrett flung himself back, bringing his plastic gun to bear on the enormous figure, but he stopped himself from firing. The thing that stood in front of him was not human. It stood nearly 7 feet high, dressed in a black uniform with inspection team, Android B212 stenciled on its front. Its face was a stylization of a human's, cleverly sculptured out of putty-colored plastic. Its eyes glowed a deep, impossible red. It swayed on 2 legs, balancing carefully, looking at Barrett, moving slowly toward him. Barrett backed away, wondering if a needle beam could stop it. He never had a chance to find out, for the android walked past him and continued up the stairs. Stenciled on the back of its uniform were the words, Rodent Control Division. This particular android, Barrett realized, was programmed only to look for rats and mice. The presence of a stowaway had made no impression on it. Presumably the other androids were similarly specialized. He stayed in an empty storage room on a lower level until he heard the sounds of the androids leaving. Then he hurried back to the control room. No guards came aboard. Exactly on schedule, the big ship left the checkpoint. Destination: Earth. The rest of the journey was uneventful. Barrett slept and ate, and, before the craft entered subspace, watched the endless spectacle of the stars through the viewport. He tried to visualize the planet he was coming to, but no pictures formed in his mind. What sort of a people built huge starships but failed to equip them with a crew? Why did they send out inspection teams, then give those teams the narrowest and most specialized sort of vision? Why did they have to deport a sizable portion of their population, and then fail to control the conditions under which the deportees lived and died? Why was it necessary for them to wipe the prisoners' minds clean of all memory of Earth? Barrett couldn't think of any answers. The control room clocks moved steadily on. counting off the minutes and hours of the trip. The ship entered, then emerged from subspace and went into deceleration orbit around a blue and green world, which Barrett observed with mixed emotions. He found it hard to realize that he was returning at last to Earth. Chapter 24. The starship landed at noon on a brilliant sunlit day, somewhere on Earth's North American continent. Barrett had planned on waiting for darkness before leaving, but the control room screens flashed an ancient and ironic warning. All passengers and crew must disembark at once. Ship rigged for full decontamination procedure. 20 minutes. He didn't know what was meant by full decontamination procedure. But since the crew was emphatically ordered to leave, a respirator might not provide much safety. Of the two dangers, leaving the ship seemed the lesser. The members of Group 2 had given a good deal of thought to the clothing Barrett would wear upon debarkation. Those first minutes on Earth might be crucial. No cunning could help him if his clothing was obviously strange, outlandish, alien. Typical Earth clothing was the answer, but the group wasn't sure what the citizens of Earth wore. One part of the group had wanted Barrett to dress in their reconstructed approximation of civilian dress. Another part felt that the guard's uniform he had worn on board would see him through his arrival on Earth as well. Barrett himself had agreed with a third opinion, which felt that a mechanic's one-piece coverall would be least noticeable around a space field and suffer the least change of style over the years. In the towns and cities, this disguise might put him at a disadvantage, but he had to meet one problem at a time. He quickly stripped off his guard's uniform. Underneath he wore the lightweight coveralls. His needle beam concealed, a collapsible lunchbox in his hand, Barrett walked down the corridor to the landing stage. He hesitated for a moment, wondering if he should leave the weapon on the ship. He decided not to part with it. An inspection would reveal him anyhow. With the needle beam, he would have a chance of breaking away from police. He took a deep breath and marched out of the ship and down the landing stage. There were no guards, no inspection party, no police, no army units, and no customs officials. There was no one at all. Far to one side of the wide field he could see rows of starcraft glistening in the sun. Straight ahead of him was a fence, and in it was an open gate. Barrett walked across the field, quickly but without obvious haste. He had no idea why it was all so simple. Perhaps the secret police on Earth had more subtle means of checking on passengers from starships. He reached the gate. There was no one there except a bald, middle-aged man and a boy of perhaps 10. They seemed to be waiting for him. Barrett found it hard to believe that these were government officials. Still, who knew the ways of Earth? He passed through the gate. The bald man, holding the boy by the hand, walked over to him. "I beg your pardon," the man said. "Yes?" "I saw you come from the starship. Would you mind if I ask you a few questions?" "Not at all," Barrett said, his hand near the coverall zipper beneath which lay his needle beam. He was certain now that the bald man was a police agent. The only thing that didn't make sense was the presence of the child, unless the boy was an agent in training. "The fact of the matter is," the man said, "my boy Ronnie here is doing a thesis for his 10th grade master's degree. On starships." "So I wanted to see one," Ronnie said. He was an undersized child with a pinched, intelligent face. "He wanted to see one," the man explained. "I told him it wasn't necessary, since all the facts and pictures are in the encyclopedia. But he wanted to see one." "It gives me a good opening paragraph," Ronnie said. "Of course," Barrett said, nodding vigorously. He was beginning to wonder about the man. For a member of the secret police, he was certainly taking a devious route. "You work on the ships?" Ronnie asked. "That's right." "How fast do they go?" "In real or subspace?" Barrett asked. This question seemed to throw Ronnie off his stride. He pushed out his lower lip and said, "Gee, I didn't know they went in subspace." He thought for a moment. "As a matter of fact, I don't think I know what subspace is." Barrett and the boy's father smiled understandingly. "Well," Ronnie said, "how fast do they go in real space?" 100,000 miles an hour, Barrett said, naming the first figure that came into his head. The boy nodded, and his father nodded. "Very fast," the father said. "And much faster in subspace, of course," Barrett said. "Of course," the man said. "Starships are very fast indeed. They have to be." Quite long distances involved. Isn't that right, sir? Very long distances, Barent said. How is the ship powered? Ronnie asked. In the usual way, Barent told him. We had triplex boosters installed last year, but that comes more under the classification of auxiliary power. I've heard about those triplex boosters, the man said. Tremendous things. They're adequate, Barent said judiciously. He was certain now that this man was just what he purported to be, a citizen with no particular knowledge of spacecraft, simply bringing his son to the starport. How do you get enough air? Ronnie asked. We generate our own, Barent said. But air isn't any trouble. Water's the big problem. Water isn't compressible, you know. It's hard to store in sufficient quantities. And then there's the navigation problem when the ship emerges from subspace. What is subspace? Ronnie asked. In effect, Barent said, it's simply a different level of real space. But you can find all that in your encyclopedia. Of course you can, Ronnie, the boy's father said. We mustn't keep the pilot standing here. I'm sure he has many important things to do. I am rather rushed, Barent said. Look around all you want. Good luck on your thesis, Ronnie. Barent walked for 50 yards, his spine tingling, expecting momentarily to feel the blow of a needlebeam or a shotgun. But when he looked back, the father and son were turned away from him, earnestly studying the great vessel. Barent hesitated a moment, deeply bothered. So far, the whole thing had been entirely too easy. Suspiciously easy. But there was nothing he could do but go on. The road from the starport led past a row of storage sheds to a section of woods. Barent walked until he was out of sight. Then he left the road and went into the woods. He had had enough contact with people for his first day on Earth. He didn't want to stretch his luck. He wanted to think things over, sleep in the woods for the night, and then, in the morning, go to a city or town. He pushed his way past dense underbrush into the forest proper. Here he walked through shaded groves of giant oaks. All around him was the chirp and bustle of unseen bird and animal life. Far in front of him was a large white sign nailed to a tree. Barent reached it and read, Forestdale National Park. Picnickers and campers welcome. Barent was a little disappointed, even though he realized that there would be no virgin wilderness so near a starport. In fact, on a planet as old and as highly developed as Earth, there was probably no virgin land at all, except what had been preserved in national forests. The sun was low on the horizon, and there was a chill in the long shadows thrown across the forest floor. Barent found a comfortable spot under a gigantic oak, arranged leaves for a bed, and lay down. He had a great deal to think about. Why, for example, hadn't guards been posted at Earth's most important contact point, an interstellar terminus? Did security measures start later at the towns and cities? Or was he already under some sort of surveillance, some infinitely subtle spy system that followed his every movement and apprehended him only when ready? Or was that too fanciful? Could it be that? Good evening, a voice said, close to his right ear. Barent flung himself away from the voice in a spasm of nervous reaction, his hand diving for his needlebeam. And a very pleasant evening it is, the voice continued. Here in Forestdale National Park. The temperature is 78.2 degrees Fahrenheit, humidity 23%. Barometer steady at 29.9. Old campers, I'm sure, already recognize my voice. For the new nature lovers among you, let me introduce myself. I am Oki, your friendly oak tree. I'd like to welcome all of you, old and new, to your friendly national forest. Sitting upright in the gathering darkness, Barent peered around, wondering what kind of a trick this was. The voice really did seem to come from the giant oak tree. The enjoyment of nature, said Oki, is now easy and convenient for everyone. You can enjoy complete seclusion and still be no more than a 10-minute walk from public transportation. For those who do not desire seclusion, we have guided tours at nominal cost through these ancient glades. Remember to tell your friends about your friendly national park. The full facilities of this park are waiting for all lovers of the great outdoors. A panel in the tree opened. Out slid a bedroll, a thermos bottle, and a box supper. I wish you a pleasant evening, said Oki, amid the wild splendor of nature's wonderland. And now the National Symphony Orchestra under the direction of Otter Krug brings you The Upland Glades by Ernesto Nestrichella, recorded by the National North American Broadcasting Company. This is your friendly oak tree, signing off. Music emanated from several hidden speakers. Barent scratched his head. Then, deciding to take matters as they came, he ate the food, drank coffee from the thermos, unrolled the bedroll, and lay down. Sleepily he contemplated the notion of a forest wired for sound, equipped with food and drink, and none of it more than 10 minutes from public transportation. Earth certainly did a lot for her citizens. Presumably they liked this sort of thing. Or did they? Could this be some huge and subtle trap which the authorities had set for him? He tossed and turned for a while, trying to get used to the music. After a while, it blended into the background of windblown leaves and creaking branches. Barent went to sleep. This concludes the 6th part of 8 total of The Status Civilization by Robert Sheckley, produced by Best Audiobooks for free.